There is no progress towards a ceasefire. The Russians are there to do this, what I call KGB rope-a-dope. They just throw another meeting out there, another negotiation, another discussion, another set of technical issues to be resolved. And in the meantime, they don't do anything.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Sir Bill Browder on the show. He's reacted to Liberation Day, Trump's tariffs, of course, how this will affect Ukraine in terms of how much money Europe and other allies are willing to spend on aid. We've also spoken to him about this meeting between one of Putin's envoys and members of Washington and the fact that they lifted sanctions on two pretty significant people to let them into the US. We've also spoken to him about this move from Putin. He's basically told Ukrainians living in now Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine that they can either become a Russian citizen or they'll face punishment. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. So Bill Browder, thank you for joining the Trump Report today. We'll dive straight into Liberation Day and the effects that it might have on Ukraine. We saw the Trump administration invoke the various different percentages of tariffs on around 15 or so countries in order to stop these countries from ripping off the United States. Some of these countries are quite hostile towards Trump's decision to do this. A lot of experts say that this will lead to global economic disruption as well. I just heard someone on Mike Graham's show said that it was economic, I think he said liability. And when you're looking at this situation right now, Bill, how do you think this will affect the progress we're trying to make in ending this war, but also supporting Ukraine?
Well, in terms of supporting Ukraine, it's definitely not helpful in the sense that the U.S. has pretty much made it clear that U.S. financial aid for Ukraine is going to diminish or disappear. Europe has claimed or has said that they don't want to allow Ukraine to capitulate for all sorts of good reasons, which means that Europe has got to come up with more money. And at the same time as Europe has to come up with more money, we're now facing this situation where there's an inflicted economic crisis on Europe from the United States, which means that Europe is going to have less money. And so it all plays into a really bad situation for Ukraine, bad situation for Europe, and bad situation for pretty much everybody. It's hard to get one's head around the logic of this trade war, which came from nothing, really.
And do you think it will make these allies, the EU, the UK, Australia, various other countries, even more, I guess, reserved when it comes to working with the United States? It was already tense before when it came to negotiating this war. But after these tariffs have been inflicted on them, I wonder how the relationship can be mended between these countries and the US.
Well, in the short term, it's hard to say that would be the case at all. And it doesn't seem to be the case that the US wants to mend relations with a lot of these countries. It looks like an act of deliberate antagonism towards most countries. I know that the UK has done everything in its power to try to placate Trump. Keir Starmer got the invitation from the King to come for the second visit, unprecedented. He's been very, very cautious on retaliating. But at some point, this is just, unnecessary, unprovoked economic pain, which is being inflicted on just about everybody.
But not everyone, Bill, because Russia came out unscathed, which was an interesting point for us to discuss. Now, we know that the trade between US and Russia has significantly decreased in the last few years. But there were still questions on why Trump didn't decide to place tariffs on Russia when he did on smaller countries like Mauritius and Brunei, who do have smaller trade relations with the United States. But Trump's press secretary defended their move and said that Russia still might have sanctions placed on it when it comes to its oil, of course. But do you see that happening?
Well, everything that we've seen so far indicates that Trump doesn't want to do anything to upset Vladimir Putin, even in this global trade war where he wants to upset everybody. Putin has been carved out and given a special place. You would think that the UK would have been given a special place, given that UK has a special, quote, special relationship with the United States, that the UK has worked with the US and every conflict providing soldiers, that the UK has invited Trump to meet the king a second time, and the UK ends up with 10% sanctions and Russia 0. There's really, it's hard to put any logic on this other than the obvious logic, which is that Putin and Trump have some kind of new special relationship, which nobody knows where it comes from or why it exists, but it's there, and the facts are the facts.
Yes, they are working as friends that we saw them bicker earlier in the week, but we'll get into that. But while Liberation Day was kind of taking all the media attention the last few days, I should say, since they were announced on Wednesday night, Putin had actually sent his Kremlin envoy Kirill Dmitriev to Washington this week, which meant that the United States did have to lift sanctions on him. Now, the US and Russia have stated that the conversation that they had in Washington had significant progress on a potential ceasefire with Ukraine. He also said that it was constructive and respectful on discussions regarding economic ties, Russia's rare earth metals, and actually restoring direct flights from the US to Russia. But when you see the word progress, Bill, when it comes to a ceasefire, are you believing it?
Absolutely not. There is no progress towards a ceasefire. The Russians are there to do this, what I call KGB rope-a-dope. They just throw another meeting out there, another negotiation, another discussion, another set of technical issues to be resolved. And in the meantime, they don't do anything. It's now been 3 weeks since the Ukrainians offered to unilaterally cease fire for 30 days. And then the ball was in Russia's court. Russia has not. And they keep on talking about everything other than a ceasefire. The Kirill Dmitriev, who is the one of the economic actors or advisors to Putin, who was in Washington, who had been sanctioned and had the sanctions lifted to go to Washington, was there to talk about doing business. He was there to talk about American companies doing business in Russia. He wasn't there. He's not a military negotiator talking about ceasefires. He's a businessman. And that's what the conversation was about. He was there to talk about rare earth metals and other deals that American companies could do in Russia. And so I think that they're ready to talk about everything and anything other than stopping the war in Ukraine, which is the only thing that matters.
Who is gaslighting the rest of the world, including Ukraine, more, Bill? Is it the United States or is it Russia?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty close competition. Russia is in the business of lying in every possible way and then saying they're the ones who want peace. I mean, Putin has invaded Ukraine. If at any moment in time, without the Ukrainians saying a single thing, he could withdraw his troops from Ukraine and the war would be over. It's as simple as that. And so for him to say that there needs to be some type of negotiation, there's no negotiation needed. The only thing that has to happen is he needs to withdraw his troops. And so for him to be saying that we need to resolve the conditions that led to this war, there were no conditions other than raw, unadulterated Russian aggression. That was the only thing that led to the war. And then, of course, having Trump talk about, all this complicated stuff that needs to be resolved, there's nothing complicated. Putin needs to withdraw, plain and simple. And America has the power to bring Russia to its knees, economically and militarily. And America hasn't used that power. And if anything, just the opposite. We're seeing sanctions lifted for Kirill Dmitriev. Sanctions were lifted for one of the wives of one of Putin's closest economic partners, a guy named Rothenberg. We've not seen anything which would suggest that the United States wants to bring Putin to his knees.
Well, let's get into that lifting of sanctions, Bill. So we saw the United States lift sanctions on bringing Putin's envoy into Washington this week. And then, as you stated, they've also lifted the sanction on one of Putin's Russian associates, one of his billionaire associates' wives, Karina Rotenberg. So how significant is this when they lift these sanctions on two of these big contenders in Putin's, I guess, friendship group?
Very significant. These are bad actors. These are people that are closest to the center of power. These are people who should be sanctioned. And the moment you do that without anything in return, without any move whatsoever of Putin to stop the war, to ceasefire, even ceasefire in some small area, is just an absolutely terrible message. I mean, one or two people is not going to make or break Russia, but one or two people is terrible symbolism when what we're doing right now is trying to force Putin to stop the war.
Especially when these sanctions, Bill, were used as such leverage and such a kind of act of condemnation at the start of the war. So to lift them 3 years later when there hasn't been any sort of resolution is quite significant from the United States. But Bill, after these conversations with Russia, with Putin's envoy into Washington, we know that they said that there was significant progress, but of course there's been absolutely no ceasefire negotiated. But apparently Trump's team are advising him to not call Putin directly until a ceasefire is agreed upon. Why do you think they're telling him to do that?
Well, I mean, that's the obvious thing to do. I mean, every telephone call with Putin is a gift to Putin. It legitimizes him. It brings him in from the cold. It makes him seem like a legitimate head of state as opposed to a usurper, which is what he is. I mean, the fact that his advisors are saying that is good. But let's see how this whole thing plays itself out, because he doesn't often listen to his advisors. He does whatever he feels like doing at any moment in time.
Well, earlier in the week, we saw Trump call NBC, I think it was Sunday night, for a phone conversation where he told the journalist he was pissed off, he was angry with Vladimir Putin because he was basically questioning Volodymyr Zelensky's credibility. He was saying that Ukraine needed an interim government to rule over Ukraine, and Trump said he was pissed off by those comments. And I want to get your thoughts on what you think Zelensky felt in that moment to have Donald Trump say he was pissed off with Putin for questioning his credibility as a leader, but that's exactly what Trump did when he said that Ukraine should be holding a presidential election and that Zelensky was a dictator.
Well, whatever Zelensky was feeling at that moment, he didn't have a long time to feel it, because very shortly after, Trump made a very disparaging comment towards Zelensky, where he said he's not signing the rare earth minerals deal, and if he doesn't, bad things are going to happen. And he repeated that several times. Bad things are going to happen. And for anybody who's looked at the newest version of this rare earth mineral deals, first of all, it's not just rare earth, it's every economic asset in Ukraine. And the United States has revised the deal from a completely empty deal to a deal in which Ukraine has to pay back $100 billion to the United States, which was never a loan in the first place. It was military aid, not a loan. And to do so, they would have to basically carve out all of their economic assets and use those assets to pay back the United States, which would impoverish Ukraine into perpetuity.
And not let them rebuild.
Ukraine has there's no way in the world that Ukraine can sign that deal. And so by putting such an indecent proposal in front of Zelensky, it basically means they knew that Zelensky couldn't sign it. And in my opinion, the reason that they did that is that would be the way in which they could then blame Zelensky for the breakdown in the ceasefire negotiations, as opposed to blaming Putin.
I know I've asked you this multiple times, Bill, but I still think it is quite hard to wrap our heads around this, right? So one of the reasons why this deal hasn't been signed is, of course, because Zelensky wants it in writing that the United States will help with security, with protection, once a ceasefire is brokered. Basically, in the event that Putin and his army try and invade again, the United States will step up and help Ukraine. Now, they're not asking for much, because that's what the United States signed on to do in 1994 when they made Ukraine give up their nuclear weapons. I don't understand why 30 years later the US is so willing to break that contract. Why is that okay? Why is it okay for the United States to just completely disregard what they signed on for?
It's not okay. It's never been okay. It's not okay under Trump. It was not okay under Biden. The U.S. had made a commitment to Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear weapons that they would protect their sovereignty. Their sovereignty has now been destroyed by Russia. And the United States has a treaty obligation, an agreement obligation, Budapest Memorandum, to do something about it. And the fact that they haven't and now are coming up with this awful proposal is shameful. And what it means is that nobody is going to trust any other agreements, treaties, and other such things that the United States signs in the future if this is how they treat obligations that they've made in the past.
Especially when Ukraine had such a big stockpile of nuclear weapons. I mean, that is not an easy thing to give up. And if the roles were reversed and you asked the United States to do something like that, they of course wouldn't do it. So yeah, it is a bizarre situation. But Bill, I want to get into kind of rhetoric from Putin that contradicts what Trump says. Trump says that he still believes, even after these pissed off comments, he still believes that Putin is a man of his word. He still believes that Putin wants peace. Now, here are a few things that I feel like contradict that statement in the last week. While visiting Murmansk a few days ago, well, earlier in the week, Vladimir Putin said that he intends to wipe out Ukraine, telling his army, now it looks like we'll finish them off. And then we have this morning the Telegraph reporting some interesting facts. Now, the article of this report is called How Putin is Using Peace Talks as a Disguise to Bombard Ukraine. Now, they've got a few facts. They've done a lot of analysis on this. They said the number of Russian drone strikes targeting Ukraine has surged by more than 50% since the US-led peace talks began in mid-February. In the 30 days following February 18, when the peace talks began, some 4,776 drone strikes were launched by Russia, compared to the 3,148 drone strikes in 30 days before. Experts say that Moscow has ramped up its attacks to force concessions from Kyiv and take control of as much land as it comes, as Donald Trump pledged to bring a swift end to the fighting. So does this look like a leader that wants to end the war?
Absolutely not. Putin has no intention of ending the war. He's never had any intention of ending the war since he started the war. His ambitions in the war have been clearly stated from 1 month before the war until the start of the war, and every day since then, and they haven't diverged at all. He's not lowered his expectations. He's not in any way altered his maximalist approach to this war. And all the facts show that he's carrying on as he always has, because the simple answer is that Putin needs this war. He needs this war in order to stay in power. If he didn't have the war at this point, people would be grumbling and angry at him. And he's done this war in the first place to create a foreign enemy and divert the attention and the anger away from him towards this foreign enemy. And that's why he's at this war.
So how delusional is Trump when he keeps saying that he thinks that Putin wants peace?
Well, I don't know what Trump is actually thinking. I don't think, I think it would be wrong to say he's delusional. I think Trump is a very smart man. For whatever reason, Trump likes to bend truth towards his interpretation or his public spin. And, for example, we had a bunch of people storming the Capitol on January 6th. And he's convinced a large part of the United States population that they were peaceful protesters. He's trying to do the same thing here. He's laid out an alternative version of reality, which is unsupported by the facts. And he repeats it over and over again for whatever reason he wants to. He's hoping that some people will come to believe him in the end. And some people probably will.
We saw earlier in the week, North Korea commit another 3,000 troops to Russia, Bill. We then saw this week Putin call up 160,000 men to the Russian army in the largest round of conscription in a few years. We know that Russia has claimed some sort of gains in Donetsk, but is this the goal, to keep moving so far into the eastern region of Ukraine that more land is occupied, more troops on the ground?
Putin is losing between 1,000 and 1,500 troops a day in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have mastered the art of drone warfare. They can put very few of their own soldiers at risk, and every time a Russian pushes forward in the open fields of eastern Ukraine, the drones kill them. And so 160,000 troops is like 3 or 4 months worth of war. But the thing about Putin is that he doesn't have any pushback. There's no accountability. There's no constituents rising up. He's not a democratically elected leader. And therefore, he can throw as many soldiers into death as he wants to without any consequences to him. And his logic is very simple, that he just keeps at it. And he hopes that he wears us all out. And to a certain extent, his logic is correct. If you look at the United States, all he had to do was wait out President Biden. He ends up with a new President Trump who has a different opinion. And the U.S. is splitting off from the alliance of people supporting Ukraine. And I guess what Putin is hoping for is that as more and more soldiers are dying and as more and more time goes on, that perhaps some of European member states will peel off. And so he's fighting a war of attrition, not just in Ukraine. He's fighting a war of attrition with the entire Western world. And his hopes is that he'll win that. And he just doesn't care about the casualties in the meantime.
No, definitely not. But one of the big parts of this week's, which are stories when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, which I did feel like kind of went a little bit unnoticed. We know that around 20% of Ukraine is currently occupied by Russian forces. So Putin issued a decree on around March 20 that's kind of coming to light now, where he basically told Ukrainians living in these Russian-occupied areas that they had a choice. They could either submit to Russian law, which meant that they would become a Russian citizen, or they would face punishment. They have to make this decision by September 10. So basically, you either get punished or you become a member of Russia. It's kind of also another way for Putin to justify how this land of Ukraine is now Russian, if the negotiations did come to that decision of whether that 20% of land was rightfully Ukraine's or whether it would now belong to Russia. So what was your reaction to reading this?
Well, this is effectively Russian genocide of the Ukrainians, to make them into Russians, to call them Russians. And by the way, Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy, he was giving an interview where he was discussing how these areas of eastern Ukraine are, quote, Russian and therefore should be part of Russia. And so it's all part of the spin, the narrative to say they're Russians, they speak Russian. What's everyone fighting about here? This doesn't make any sense. And that's how they're trying to portray it. And again, it in certain circles, it convinces people. And Putin is very smart about this. He's a subtle, he's subtle in his, he's also brazen, but he does these subtle things, which, in 3 years' time, everyone says, well, I don't understand. Everyone's Russian there. Why are we worried about those places being part of Russia? They should be Russia. That's his argument. And Putin is such a long-term player because he doesn't have to worry about being kicked out of office, because he will be in office until the day he dies, unless there's a revolution. And so for him, he can take a long view. He can put this stuff out there. And in 3 years' time, he'll make these arguments and a lot of people will repeat them.
Just a final question, Bill. One of Putin's former advisors between the years 2000 and 2005, an article with him resurfaced this week. He said, the only thing you can really stop Putin in Ukraine and Europe is resistance. Resistance that is being produced by the Ukrainian military, while all Ukrainian people are heroically resisting these aggressions. My question for you, is it time for the coalition of the willing, or the US, if they want to get involved, if NATO, to be putting boots on the ground, to be throwing all their resources at Ukraine to push Russia out of the border and to completely try and end this on their own terms?
Well, boots on the ground is something I wouldn't support for one simple reason. which is that Putin can afford to lose 1,500 soldiers a day. And if we put boots on the ground, after we lose 1,500 soldiers in one day, we're going to all give up. And so I don't think we should put boots on the ground because we don't want to lose young men and women from our countries. Having said that, there's a million things we can do short of putting boots on the ground. We can triple down on military aid to Ukraine. We can lift all restrictions on Ukraine striking military targets inside of Russia. We can put jets in the air. We can put missiles in the air. We can do lots of different things that have an impact. Boots on the ground, I think, is a bad idea, but everything else short of that is a good idea.
Yeah, and we know that a lot of countries would be hesitant about sending their troops to Ukraine regardless. But financially, we need to be putting all of our resources into Ukraine. So we'll be waiting and watching the situation as it unfolds, as it does every day. So Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.